The Netherlands had been neutral in World War I and planned to do the same as Europe teetered towards war in 1939. Their willingness to provide refuge to oppressed groups made the country a primary destination for Jews escaping Nazi persecution. Hitler's guarantee of Dutch neutrality in 1939 eased many minds. Less than a year later, that promise would be broken as the Nazis invaded the Netherlands.
On May the 10th, we woke up and my father was putting paper strips on the windows to try and keep them from shattering as the planes were droning overhead.
My father and I were standing outside in the garden and we heard pang, pang, pang above our heads. And that was an air fight. And I remember my father saying, "That's the end of us." You know, up till then, because we had been neutral in the First World War. And we were Jewish. I'm Jewish.
German paratroopers landed around my former hometown of The Hague. Their intention was to capture the government and the Queen.
The royal family left for England. That was Queen Wilhelmina, Princess Juliana, Prince Bernhard, and their 2 children at the time. And very soon, Juliana apparently, it wasn't safe for her to stay in England, they figured. So she left, I think, by ship to Canada with the 2 princesses, and the 3rd daughter, Margriet, was born here. And in 43, I believe, and Margriet, when she was born, they declared that part of the hospital as Dutch territory so that she would be a Dutch citizen.
Holland never counted on that the Germans would invade Holland. The government didn't, and the people didn't expect it. It didn't happen in World War I, and they never thought it was going to happen in World War II.
The Dutch army was ill-equipped, very small.
Well, I was in Rotterdam at that time. I was a nurse in the hospital, a Koolsingel hospital, and we had already lots of wounded people, wounded soldiers in. But I said, well, we are safe here for the Red Cross on the roof. And lo and behold, the hospital was bombed.
Rotterdam got bombed. That was the end of the war, because the German threat was there. If you don't surrender, completely surrender, we're going to do the same thing to other cities.
The invasion that was to take only 1 day lasted 5. Brave Dutch resistance ended in the face of overwhelming odds. The casualties were devastating, and a stunned Dutch populace faced occupation.
In the beginning, it was hardly noticeable, except that there were some Germans.
In the beginning of the war, they tried to bribe us, more or less, you know. Tried to be friendly and all that, trying to talk us into it, that it was a good thing.
They treated us with whatever we wanted. Candies, food, whatever. And that lasted for a while, and then it changed.
The Germans handled the occupation of Holland differently than all of the other nations that they invaded. They installed a civilian government instead of the usual military command. They kept the Dutch bureaucrats and laws. Seyss-Inquart was named Reichscommissioner, and subtly Nazi control seeped into the everyday lives of the Dutch.
The announcements, how to behave and all that, to get your citizen card. And gradually they started to enforce their ruling.
In November, they asked all personnel of government institutions and municipal institutions, universities, schools, to sign a declaration of Aryan blood. And if you weren't an Aryan, it meant you were a Jew. And then slowly after that, they fired all the Jews.
I became very conscious of the war as a Jew in 1942. There was a decree by the Nazis, the occupying forces, I should say, on May the 1st, that all Jews from age 6 on had to wear a Star of David.
I had 2 very, very close friends. We grew up together. We did everything together. And all of a sudden, and they were Jewish, and all of a sudden they had to wear a star on their clothing, and I didn't. And I was allowed to go to the beach, but they weren't. and it was time to go to start school, and they were not allowed to go to the school I was supposed to go to.
And that was for my family, we weren't Jewish, really the major problem of the war, the persecutions of the Jews.
We were used to having the Jews around, and we always have been very hospitable having the Jews there, so we couldn't understand this.
The Jews are very assimilated, so the people who weren't that interested didn't even know that there was so a big problem, I think.
The other thing that was very noticeable is that my mother had to close her business, because that was also a decree by the occupiers that no Jews could have a business.
They established a ghetto in the city of Amsterdam, barbed wire around several blocks of city houses.
Slowly, people living outside Amsterdam were sent to Amsterdam. That was more
The Jews.
The Jews. That
Yeah.
was convenient, of course, for the
And
Germans.
You could feel something was terribly wrong.
In 1942 is when they started rounding up the Jews, and I believe that's when the resistance became more prominent than before. There was a lot of resentment on what they were doing to the Jews.
The Nazis made one decree after another, limiting the rights and movements of Jews in the Netherlands. For the Jews, it was a matter of survival, and clashes occurred that led to the general strike of February 25, 1941. It would be the only public protest against the Nazi treatment of Jews in all of occupied Europe.
The Jews resisted. And during one of the fights, one of the Dutch Nazi people was killed. And then, as a reprisal, the Germans raided and arrested Jewish men. They're all in the center of Amsterdam, and they were sent to a concentration camp, and nobody survived of those. And when that happened, the Dutch population, non-Jewish population, went on strike.
And how long did that?
A couple of days. Then the measures against the strike were very harsh.
Very quickly the whole thing went completely out of control.
But then gradually they started taking the newspapers, taking the radio, then there was no communication, everything was in Hitler's hands. So they could more or less brainwash us and make us believe that everything was fine.
And they confiscated everything.
If you were caught with a bicycle on the street and the Germans came along, that would be gone. They would just take it. Anything was taken. Anything of value was taken by the Germans and shipped to Germany.
Then there was hardly any provisions anymore. You got coupons for food and all that, but by the time you got there, it was not there anymore.
Anything that had a bit of rubber on it, you used it to put underneath your shoes. Our shoes were cut open at the top, the front, and the back, so to allow for growth of the shoes, because we couldn't get new shoes.
You were not allowed to have any radios. I think my dad had one hidden.
And neighbors would come also and listen to the radio that we had. It was hidden. No, it was dangerous to have you were not supposed to have a radio at all. They all had to be handed in.
The winter of 42, my father had pneumonia and he was in a hospital, and he didn't come home anymore. He was picked up by the Germans for interrogation and subsequently shipped off to a camp, a Dutch concentration camp called Vught, near 's-Hertogenbosch, as a political prisoner because he was betrayed. He did some underground work.
The concentration camp at Vught was used primarily for Dutch political prisoners, although it was used for Jewish prisoners as well. The camp was notorious for the viciousness of its guards and diabolical tortures that claimed many thousands of lives. In the meantime, the Nazis were rounding up Jews throughout the Netherlands and began shipping them to extermination camps in Poland and Germany. For many Jews, there was only one hope: to go into hiding. 24,000 were hidden by Dutch Gentiles at great personal risk. The dangers they faced have been immortalized by the diary of Anne Frank.
And all of a sudden, one of my little friends, Florence, she disappeared. And that disappearing was really called going in hiding.
Every day you would come to school, there would be some kids missing.
I was in the same school as Anne Frank, and every day there were fewer children. Either the families had been caught in raids, or they went underground, as in Anne Frank's case, or in my case, or a few families committed suicide, the whole family.
And we went on the streetcar when we were still allowed to, and after about 2 stops, the SS was there, or the Gestapo, whatever, and they hauled all the Jews off the streetcar. I crawled around the streetcar and I went back home and just said, Mom is gone, I don't know where. From that point on, everything went downhill.
One day my father came home and said, we've been denounced, and that night we stayed as a family, the 4 of us. My older sister was already gone, in a friend's house, but he couldn't keep us. And the next morning we were on our way to our different addresses. My parents to one, and my sister to one, and I to another one. So that was the end of the family.
There was a certain cautiousness. There was a lot of people did not commit themselves to take in German people, because if you, well, as we know, if you were found to hide Jewish people, you were sent off to concentration camps along with them.
And then lots of the Jewish people, they went into hiding with the Catholics, the Protestants, and so on.
This came down from the pulpits in the churches, mainly in the north of Holland. The Protestants, more than the Roman Catholics, said, start something, let's help the kids.
My parents had a Jewish family couple, and they had a baby.
Then the grown-ups were put in the theater in Amsterdam, in the heart of Amsterdam, and the children were taken across the street to a Jewish daycare center. We were held there, and it was full. There were 232 kids in there. Eventually they would be transported to the camp in Holland, which is Westerbork.
Westerbork was a transit camp where Jews were gathered for transportation east. There were weekly trains to Auschwitz, as well as to Sobibor, Theresienstadt, and Bergen-Belsen. Today, it's a museum that commemorates the lives of those who passed through the camp en route to their deaths. Over 100,000 made the trip, never to return.
And we were saved by one of the larger underground groups. It's called the NV group. And they took all of us, not at the same time, but by bunches, out of the daycare center and said, come on, I will take you to your hiding place on the back of a bicycle. You are no longer Jewish. You're going to a family that's Christian Reformed. You got to go to church if you are allowed out in the street. You have to do as if you're one of them. You became a liar at the age of 6 and 7. You learned to lie, to save yourself and to save your rescuers.
In our case, there were close calls.
How many?
3, actually. The first was on the 5th of December, and I remember that because it was St. Nicholas Eve, and they were banging on the door, and the Germans came and they said, we want your cigars, and if you don't give them, we'll take the Jewish child you have.
Fear gripped those who hid Jews and those who were in hiding.
They took everything off the bed, put a piece of wood underneath, and put me with a sort of a blanket, and put me there, and the spring, and another piece of wood, and then the double mattresses, and they made up the bed perfectly. So that was my going to bed when it was dangerous. 2 Nazis did show up in the house, and they ran through it, and they came upstairs. They looked at the one bed, her little sister, looked, and then they looked at my bed, took a bayonet, stabbed it through it. It didn't hit me because I was between the wood.